Kira had lived in the shadows of Orbital Station, Haven, for almost 2 years now, and she had learned to survive by staying invisible and avoiding trouble at all costs. Because trouble always found her kind eventually, she was Drakenai, and her people were feared across the galaxy for good reason, because her ancestors had once ruled 1,000 worlds with fire and terror, and they had burned cities and taken slaves and made entire species bow before them for 10,000 years until the humans came. The humans had changed everything, and Kira remembered the stories her mother had told her before the bombs fell on their homeworld. And her mother had said that the humans were different from any enemy the Drakenai had ever faced, because they did not fight with honor or follow the old ways of challenge and combat, and instead they came in endless waves, and they learned from every battle, and they adapted to every strategy, and they never stopped coming, no matter how many of them died. Within 15 years, the great Drakenai empire that had stood for millennia was nothing but ash and memory, and Kira had been just a hatchling when it ended, and she had spent the 40 years since then running and hiding and trying to survive in a galaxy that hated her kind. Now she was one of the last of her people, and she lived like a ghost on this human station, and she scavenged for food in the cargo district, and she slept behind storage containers, and she avoided everyone, especially the humans, because the humans terrified her more than any other species. It was not because the humans were cruel to her, because honestly, they mostly ignored her, and it was not because they threatened her or spat at her the way the Valorians did, because the Valorians had lost 3 colony worlds to Drakenai raids, and they had never forgotten. No, the humans scared her because they were impossible to understand, and they made no sense at all, and Kira had studied them for years, trying to figure out what made them so dangerous, and the more she learned, the more confused she became. Humans kept predators as pets, and they called these deadly animals their family, and they let them sleep in their beds, and they mourned when these creatures died as if they had lost a child. Humans poisoned themselves with fermented drinks for fun, and they called it relaxing, and they did it over and over again, even though it made them sick. Humans rushed into burning buildings to save strangers, and they jumped into frozen water to rescue people they had never met, and they died for beings who would never know their names. And worst of all, humans looked at Kira without fear, and that was the thing that terrified her most, because every other species in the galaxy looked at a Drakenai with hatred or terror, and both of those reactions made sense to her. But the humans looked at her with curiosity, and sometimes even warmth, and she did not understand it, and things she did not understand were dangerous. On the evening that would change her entire life, Kira was searching for food near the residential blocks when she heard a sound that made her freeze in place. And it was crying, and it was coming from a dark access corridor that most beings avoided. She should have walked away, because getting involved with human problems was the last thing a Drakenai refugee needed, but the crying continued, and it was high and small and desperate, and something ancient stirred in her chest. It was an instinct older than the wars and older than her people's conquests, and it was something that remembered when Drakenai females had guarded their eggs with their lives and had burned anyone who threatened their young. Kira moved into the corridor before she could stop herself, and there she found a human child sitting alone against the wall, and the girl was tiny with messy brown hair and tears running down her round face, and she could not have been more than 5 years old. The child looked up as Kira approached, and her green scales must have been visible even in the dim light, and Kira waited for the scream that would surely come, because human children were taught to fear monsters, and what was she if not a monster? But the little girl did not scream, and instead she sniffled and wiped her nose and said, "Are you a dragon? Because my daddy reads me stories about dragons." Kira had no idea how to respond to that, and she stood frozen in place trying to find words, and before she could say anything, she heard heavy footsteps echoing down the corridor. A human male appeared, and he was breathing hard, and his eyes were wild with worry, and he was tall with tired eyes and dark hair that had gray in it, even though he seemed young and his hands were rough with the calluses of a worker. The man rushed forward and scooped the child into his arms, and he held her tight and said, "Lily, I told you not to wander off, and I was looking everywhere." For youth girl wrapped her arms around his neck and said, "I got lost, Daddy, but the dragon lady found me, and she stayed with me." Man looked at Kira then, and she braced herself for the suspicion and the anger, and the quiet threat that humans delivered so efficiently when they felt their young were in danger. Instead, he simply said, "Thank you, and I am Daniel Brooks, and this is my daughter, Lily." Kira found her voice after a long moment, and she said, "I did nothing because she was simply here when I arrived." Daniel shook his head and said, "You stayed with her, and that is not nothing." And then he studied her face with an expression she could not read, and he said, "You are the Draconite who lives in the cargo district, because I have seen you around the station." Her scales tightened against her body, because of course he had noticed her, and humans noticed everything, and that was part of what made them so dangerous. Daniel shifted his daughter in his arms and said, "I work maintenance on the lower decks, and Lily usually stays at the station daycare. But they closed early today because they were short on staff." And he sighed and said, "I do not suppose you know anyone who does childcare, because the waiting lists for alternatives are months long." Kira stared at him because he was asking her for childcare recommendations, and she was a Draconite, and her people had once burned human colonies and enslaved human populations, and he was asking her about babysitters. "Daddy," the little girl said, while tugging at his sleeve, "and the dragon lady could watch me because she is nice." The silence that followed was the strangest moment of Kira's entire life, and she watched Daniel's face for the disgust and the polite rejection and the obvious refusal that would surely come because a Draconite caring for a human child was absurd, and it was wrong, and no sane human would ever consider it. Daniel looked at his daughter, and then he looked at Kira, and his tired eyes met her golden ones, and he asked, "Would you?" Kira did not know what to say, and she did not know what to think, and she stood there in that dark corridor with a human man and his child, and she felt the entire galaxy shift beneath her feet. She should have said no, and she should have walked away, and she should have gone back to a safe, invisible life in the shadows of the cargo district. Instead, she heard herself say yes. 3 days after that strange meeting in the corridor, Kira stood in Daniel's small apartment and wondered if she had lost her mind completely, because nothing about this situation made any sense. The apartment was clean but cramped with 2 bedrooms, and a small kitchen and a living area filled with toys and books and the scattered evidence of a life shared between a father and his daughter. Daniel had offered her payment in real credits that would be transferred to an account he helped her set up, and it was more money than she would have earned in months of scavenging and more stability than she had known in years. But he had also offered her something else, and it was a small room next to the apartment that had been used for storage. And he had cleaned it out and put in a bed that was long enough for her tail, and he had said, "It is not much, but it is warm, and it locks from the inside. And it is better than sleeping behind cargo containers." She had not asked how he knew about the cargo containers, because humans always knew things, and that was just how they were now. Lily sat on the floor surrounded by stuffed animals and toys, and she was showing each one to Kira and explaining their names and their personalities and their complicated relationships with each other, and the child talked constantly without seeming to need. Kira watched her and tried to understand what she had agreed to, because the Draconite elders who still lived scattered across the galaxy would call this the ultimate shame, and they would say she had become a servant to the species that had destroyed them. But as Lily held up a stuffed creature and asked, "Do dragons like tea parties?" Kira found that she did not care what the elders would think. The first weeks were an education that no book could have prepared her for, because human children were strange and wonderful and completely impossible to predict. Lily could fall from furniture at heights that would kill a Draconite hatchling, and she would bounce up laughing as if nothing had happened. and her body seemed to be made of rubber and stubbornness. But she could also cry for an hour because her favorite cup was dirty, or because the cartoon she wanted to watch was not available, or because the sandwich Kira made was cut into squares instead of triangles. Her emotions changed like weather on a gas giant, and she could go from furious tantrum to giggling joy in the span of minutes, and Kira learned to simply wait out the storms and trust that sunshine would follow. The girl was also curious about everything, and she asked questions without stopping, and she wanted to know if Kira could change colors, and why she did not fly everywhere, and whether her tail had feelings, and if she had ever eaten anyone. That last question made Kira pause uncomfortably, but Lily had already moved on to asking about a passing cleaning drone before she could figure out how to answer. Daniel worked long hours, and sometimes he worked double shifts when the station's old systems needed extra crews, and he would come home exhausted with grease under his fingernails and dark circles under his eyes. But he always made time to ask about Lily's day, and he always listened to her stories about what she and Kira had done, and he always thanked Kira for taking care of his daughter. He asked about Kira too, and his questions were genuine, and he wanted to know how she was adjusting, and if she needed anything, and if the room was comfortable, and if she was eating enough. It confused her because she had expected human hospitality to be a performance, and she had expected a thin mask over suspicion and hatred. But Daniel treated her like a person, and sometimes almost like a friend. One evening, after Lily had finally gone to sleep following a long negotiation about bedtime, Daniel sat down across from Kira at the kitchen table, and he looked tired, but there was something he wanted to say. He asked if he could ask her something personal, and Kira felt her scales tighten with unease, but she told him he could ask. He said the war between humans and your people, and then he paused to choose his words, and he said, "Do you hate us for it?" The question hung in the air like smoke, and Kira thought about lying, and she thought about deflecting, and she thought about all the defenses she had built over 40 years of survival. Instead, she found herself telling him the truth, and she said, "I was young when it ended, and I remember fear more than hatred, and my mother was killed in the bombardment of our homeworld, and I was raised in refugee camps where they taught me that humans were monsters who destroyed for pleasure." She paused and then continued and said, "But I have lived among many species since then, and I have seen cruelty from all of them, and I have seen kindness from all of them." And she met his eyes and said, "I have seen more kindness from you in 3 weeks than from some species I lived among for years." Daniel nodded slowly and said, "For what it is worth, I am sorry for what my species did to yours, because the history I learned painted it as liberation and freeing the galaxy from Draconite oppression, but I have met enough veterans to know that war is never that simple and never that clean." Kira said quietly that his people were not wrong, because the Draconite Empire was cruel, and they burned worlds and took slaves and called it civilization, and perhaps they deserved their fate. Daniel said, "Maybe the Empire did, but you did not, and Lily did not deserve what happened to her mother either, because sometimes the innocent pay for sins they never committed." Kira looked at him with new understanding and asked about Lily's mother. Daniel's voice was steady, but his eyes held old pain when he said she died 3 years ago in a medical transport accident, and she never even got to see Lily start school. They sat in silence for a moment, and Kira realized that they were two beings from species that had torn each other apart, and here they were sharing the quiet understanding of loss. She finally asked him why he had trusted her with Lily, because he must have known what others would say, and a Draconite caring for a human child would make the whole station think he was crazy. Daniel shrugged and said, "Maybe I am crazy, but when I saw you in that corridor, you did not run, and you stayed with a crying child who was not your species, and not your responsibility, and not anything to you, and that told me more about who you are than any history book ever could." He stood up and stretched his tired muscles and said, "Besides, Lily likes you, and her judgment of character is usually better than mine." He went to his room, and Kira sat alone in the quiet apartment. listening to the hum of the station and the soft breathing of a sleeping child nearby for the first time in 40 years. She felt something she barely recognized, and it took her a long time to understand what it was. She felt safe. 4 months had passed since Kira moved into Daniel's spare room, and she had started to believe that maybe her life could stay like this forever, and maybe she had finally found a place where she could belong. She should have known better, because hope was always the first thing to die on that terrible afternoon she had taken Lily to the station's park, which was a biodome filled with plants from Earth and humans. Seemed to need green-growing things for their mental health, and Lily loved running through the grass and climbing the trees. They were not alone in the park because a group of Valorian children played on the other side of the dome, and their purple feathers were bright in the artificial sunlight, and their parents watched. From nearby benches, Kira felt their eyes on her like physical weight against her scales, and she kept her wings pressed tight to her back and made herself as small as possible and avoided looking at anyone directly. It had been working for months, and she had moved through the station like a ghost and drawn as little attention as possible while caring for Lily, and she had let herself hope that it could continue. The trouble started when Lily's ball rolled across the grass toward the Valorian children, and Lily chased after it the way human children chased everything without hesitation or fear, and she accidentally bumped into a Valorian boy about her size. The boy squawked in surprise, and his feathers puffed up with distress, and his mother was on her feet instantly, with her purple crest raised in an aggressive display. Shrieked at Kira to get her creature away from her son. Lily froze and looked between the angry Valorian and Kira with confusion on her small face, and she said, "I'm sorry because it was an accident." The Valorian mother snapped that she was not talking to the human whelp, and she pointed at Kira and demanded to know why a Draconai was allowed near children, and did the humans not know what these monsters did and what they were capable of doing? Other parents were gathering now, and Kira saw fear in some faces and anger in others, and worst of all, curiosity, because a crowd forming around a Draconai was never good news. Kira kept her voice level and said she was the child's caretaker, and they would leave and cause no further disturbance. The Valorian laughed, and it was a sharp, ugly sound, and she said, "The humans let you care for their young," and asked if they were insane or simply stupid, and she turned to the crowd and said her grandmother told her stories about the Draconai and how they raided Valorian colonies and took their people as slaves, and how they ate their own young when food was scarce. That last part was a lie, and it was old war propaganda. But Kira knew better than to argue, and she moved toward Lily to gather her and escape this situation before it got worse. The Valorian stepped into her path and told her not to walk away and not to dare ignore her after what her kind did to the Valorian people. Lily's voice was small and frightened when she asked what was happening. Kira told her it was all right, and they were going home now, even though nothing was all right. The Valorian said they were not going anywhere until station security arrived, and she was filing a complaint about a Draconai threatening children in a public space, and she would have Kira expelled from this station and expelled from this entire sector. Kira said she had threatened no one. The Valorian's voice rose to a screech, and she said, "Your existence is a threat, and every breath you take is a reminder of what we lost, and you should have been exterminated with the rest of your filthy kind." Something in Kira broke at those words, and it was not her control and not her composure, but something deeper inside her, and she felt her scales shift color from green to a deep warning red, and her wings unfurled slightly in the ancient threat display of her species. The crowd gasped, and the Valorian stumbled backward, and fear replaced the hatred in her eyes. And then something happened that Kira would never forget for as long as she lived. Lily ran forward and placed herself directly between Kira and the mob and the tiny human child. Face down, the crowd of adults with her small hands balled into fists stopped being mean to her. Lily shouted, and her voice carried across the park with surprising force, and she said, "Kira is my friend, and she is nice, and she takes care of me, and you are all being bullies." The silence that followed was complete and total, and no one seemed to know what to do or what to say. Kira's scales faded back to green, and she stared at this 5-year-old human who had just positioned herself to protect Dragon from an angry mob, and something in her chest felt like it was breaking and reforming into a completely new shape. She said softly for Lily to come to her. Lily turned and ran to her and wrapped her small arms around Kira's leg and said fiercely that she would not let them hurt her. Kira gathered the child into her arms and held her carefully and said, "I know, little one, and I know you will not." Station security arrived minutes later, and Kira expected to be arrested and dragged to the holding cells, but instead the officer was a human woman with gray in her red hair. As she looked at the situation with tired eyes, she asked if anyone was hurt. Everyone tried to talk at once to explain and accuse and justify, but the officer held up her hand and asked again if anyone was hurt. There were head shakes all around and no one was injured. The officer told everyone to go home, and she pointed at the Valorian mother and said she could file a complaint at the security office, but she should know that threatening to exterminate a refugee species was a hate crime under human law, and this station operated under human jurisdiction. Then she looked at Kira and told her to go home and keep a low profile for a few days. Kira nodded while still holding Lily, and she turned to leave, but then paused and said, "Thank you." The officer shrugged and said she knew who Daniel Brooks was, and he was a good man who worked himself half to death for his kid, and he trusted Kira enough to let her care for his daughter, and that was enough for her. As Kira carried Lily home, she realized that her scales were wet and she was crying, and she had not cried since she was a hatchling. Lee patted her face gently and said it was okay because they were safe now and everything would be fine. Kira held her tighter and believed her. 6 months had passed since Kira moved into Daniel's apartment, and she had started to feel like she belonged there, and like maybe this was what home felt like. The attack came during the station's night cycle when the lights dimmed and most residents slept, and Kira was awake because she often stayed up during these hours, and she was reading human stories on a datapad Daniel had given her. She found their fiction fascinating because it was full of themes about redemption and second chances and forgiveness, and humans seemed to believe that anyone could change and anyone could be saved. The first warning was the smell of smoke seeping through the ventilation, and it was acrid and chemical and wrong. And then the alarms began to wail. Kira was at Lily's door in seconds, and the child was already awake with her eyes wide with fear, and she was clutching her stuffed dragon toy that Daniel had given her because she said it looked just like Kira. Lily asked what was happening. Kira kept her voice calm and said there was a fire and they needed to leave right now, and she asked where her father was. Lily said he was working the night shift. Kira scooped Lily into her arms and moved to the apartment door, and when she touched the handle, she hissed and pulled back because the metal was burning hot. The fire was in the corridor outside. She moved to the window, but they were on the inner ring of the station, and there was no outside and no escape pods, and just more corridors and more residential blocks, and through the small window she could see smoke filling the hallway and flames licking at the doors of other apartments. Lily whimpered that she was scared. Kira said she knew, and she held the child tighter while her mind raced through options because the ventilation was already compromised and smoke was seeping into the apartment, and emergency services would be overwhelmed since the residential block housed thousands of people. She looked at her wings, and they were designed for catching starlight in the void of space and not really meant for flying in atmosphere, but they could glide under the right conditions. The station's central atrium was 3 levels down, and it had open air and lower gravity, and if she could get there, then they would be safe. But first she had to get through the far Draconi, were resistant to heat because of their evolutionary past, and their ancestors had nested near volcanic vents, and their scales could handle temperatures that would kill most species. But Lily was human, and humans were soft and fragile, and they burned so easily. Kira made her decision, and she stripped the blankets from Lily's bed and wrapped the child in layers of fabric until she was almost invisible beneath the protection, and then she removed her own robe and wrapped that around the bundle too. She looked at Lily through a gap in the wrappings and said that she needed to listen carefully and stay completely still and not move and not speak and barely breathe unless she had to. She told Lily she was going to carry her through the fire and her scales would protect them both, but Lily had to trust her. She asked if Lily trusted her. Lily nodded without any hesitation and said, "I trust you." Kira pressed the wrapped child against her chest and covered her completely with her wings, and then she opened the door and walked into the flames. The heat was immediate and intense, and worse than she had expected because the fire had spread through the ventilation, and something chemical was feeding it, and her scales darkened as they absorbed and deflected the heat. But she could feel pain building in every nerve. She moved quickly and navigated by memory through smoke so thick she could barely see, and other residents were emerging from their apartments, and some were running and some were screaming, and some had already fallen. She could not help them, and she could only help the small bundle pressed against her chest and the tiny heartbeat she could feel through the layers of fabric. The stairwell to the atrium was blocked by burning debris, and Kira did not hesitate, and she spread her wings and felt agony as the heated air blistered the delicate membranes, and she launched herself over the obstruction. It was not really flying and barely even gliding, and just a controlled fall that cleared the blockage and sent her tumbling down the stairs, and she landed hard and absorbed the impact with her own body while keeping Lily cushioned and protected. Her scales were cracking now with deep fissures along her arms and back where the heat had been too intense, and her blood seeped from the wounds, and it was dark and thick. She was through the fire, and the atrium spread before her, with emergency lighting casting everything in red, and rescue teams were already there treating survivors. Kira staggered forward with her wings dragging on the ground and leaving a trail of blood and shed scales behind her, and a human paramedic saw her and ran to meet her. Kira managed to say help and help the child. She unwrapped Lily with trembling claws, and the girl emerged coughing but unburned and scared but alive and completely unharmed. Paramedics stared in disbelief at the perfect protected child, and then at the shattered Draconai who had carried her through fire. Lily reached for Kira and said her name and said she was hurt bad. Kira said she was all right, even though she was not all right, and her vision was going gray at the edges, and her legs gave out, and she felt the cold floor against her broken scales. She said again that she was all right, and Lily was safe now, and that was all that mattered. The last thing she heard before everything went dark was Lily screaming her name. Kira woke up in a medical bay surrounded by machines that beeped and hummed, and her entire body felt like one giant wound, but she was alive, and that itself was a surprise. Daniel was sitting in a chair beside her bed, and Lily had fallen asleep in his lap, and his face was drawn with exhaustion and something else that might have been grief or gratitude or both. He said quietly that she was awake, and he was careful not to disturb his sleeping daughter. Kira tried to speak, but her throat was raw from smoke, and Daniel held a cup of water to her lips, and she drank carefully. The first word she managed was Lily's name. Daniel's voice cracked slightly when he said that. Lily was perfect, and there was not a scratch on her, and it was because of Kira. And then he said the doctors had told him Kira should be dead. He said she had third-degree burns over 40% of her body and smoke inhalation and blood loss, and they said no one could have survived carrying someone through that fire. Kira said weakly that Drake and I were resistant to heat. Daniel shook his head and said not that resistant, according to the xenobiologists who had treated her, and they said she pushed past every biological limit her species had, and they said it should have been impossible. Kira looked at the sleeping child and at the small hand that had somehow found one of her bandaged claws and wrapped around it, and she said, "Some things are worth the impossible." Daniel was quiet for a moment, and then He said the fire was not an accident, and station security found evidence that someone had set it deliberately, and they had targeted the section of the residential block where Draconite refugees lived, and 3 others of her people had died. Kira closed her eyes, because of course there were always those who could not let go of old hatreds and who needed someone to blame. Daniel continued and said they had made arrests, and it was a Valorian extremist group who wanted to purge the station of what they called Draconite infiltrators, and they had not known Lily would be there, and they had not cared about any of the non-Draconite residents who might die in the fire. They had only cared about killing her people. Kira said it was not the first time, and it would not be the last. Daniel's voice hardened with anger. She had never heard from him before, and he said it should be the last, and what she did by carrying his daughter through fire and nearly dying to save her was not what monsters do, and it was what heroes do. Lily stirred then and blinked awake, and when she saw Kira's eyes were open, her face lit up with pure joy. She said Kira was awake and told her daddy to look, and she scrambled from his lap and leaned over the bed carefully, avoiding the bandages, and she said she had been so scared because Kira was hurt so bad, but the doctors fixed her, and they said she was going to be okay. He asked if Kira was going to be okay. Kira found herself smiling despite the pain, and she said, "Yes, little one, and I am going to be okay." Lily said, "Good, because you cannot leave, and you are my family now." And Daddy said so. Kira looked at Daniel, and he nodded and said he had started the paperwork for permanent residency status and formal guardianship rights if she wanted them. Kira said she did not understand. Daniel explained that it meant she was not a refugee anymore, and not on paper, and not in any way that mattered, and it meant she was part of their family legally and officially, and it meant no one could ever expel her from the station or any human territory ever again. He reached out and took her uninjured hand and said, "It means you have a home." The word hit her like a physical blow, because she had not had a home since the fires of her homeworld 40 years ago, and she had forgotten what it felt like to belong somewhere and to someone. Daniel said there was something else, and the news feeds had picked up the story, and that the Draconite risking her life to save a human child was being talked about everywhere, and politicians were using it to push for better refugee rights, and some people were calling her a hero. Kira said she did not want fame, and she only wanted to save Lily. Daniel smiled and said he knew, and that was why she deserved it. In the weeks that followed, as Kira healed, she watched the world change in small ways around her, and the Valorian woman from the park sent a formal apology because her own children had demanded it after seeing the news station. Residents who had avoided her for months now nodded in greeting when she passed, and a human child in the market called her the Dragon Hero, and his mother did not tell him to be quiet. It was not perfect, and there were still those who hated her on sight and who would never see past her scales to the person beneath, and the universe had not suddenly become safe for the Draconite, but it was better, and sometimes that was enough. On the day she was released from medical care, Daniel took her and Lily to the repaired residential block, and their apartment had survived mostly intact, and her room was exactly as she had left it, with one addition. There was a child's drawing taped to the wall, and it showed a green figure with wings holding hands with 2 smaller figures, and one had brown hair, and one was taller. Lily said proudly that she made it for Kira, and it was their family. Kira looked at the careful crayon strokes of a 5-year-old, trying to capture something she felt, and she thought about the long journey that had brought her here from the ashes of her homeworld, through decades of fear and survival, to this small room and this small family and this small moment of peace. She said it was beautiful, and she meant it. Daniel put a hand on her shoulder and said, "Welcome home." Kira, the Draconite, who had feared humans, looked at the man who had trusted her with his child, and at the child who had stood between her and the mob, and at the drawing that showed a dragon as part of a family. She said yes, and her voice was steady for the first time in 40 years, and she said, Home outside the window, the stars wheeled slowly past, and they were the same stars that had watched the rise and fall of empires, and the same stars that had seen humans spread across the galaxy with their impossible stubbornness and their strange capacity for trust. The universe was vast and often cruel, and full of old hatreds and older fears, but in one small apartment on a space station far from anywhere, Important a dragon had found her family, and that was more than enough.